Welcome back to our Eagle Perspective podcast. I'm Mike Siciliano, Dean of Students of the Upper School. I am joined today by a very esteemed guest, John Stonestreet.
Esteemed. I don't get that very often. That's great.
Oh, come on.
I'm very esteemed.
I am sure you get that all the time. President of the Colson Center. Thank you so much for being here, first of all.
That's great. It's great to be here at the school. I'm super impressed. What a beautiful place.
We're very lucky in that regard, and we got a lot to talk about. I know you spoke to us. I was fortunate to get to sit in a couple sessions with our staff, and you're going to be speaking with our parents. There's a couple things I got to bring up just to start, though. So number one, seems like you've taken a lot of shots at us about winter break.
I just
Can
don't
we
understand.
talk about that?
I just don't understand. We have my kids have a winter break, but we're in Colorado where there's
Right.
winter.
Well,
how can you have a winter break with no winter?
I'm so glad you asked, John. So let me try and reframe this for you. You know, it's important, I think, that our kids learn what winter is because they don't experience it
Because they don't
here,
actually have
right?
it.
So for the good of humanity, we give them a week to go find it somewhere and go experience it.
Okay, so this is
Right?
not trying to escape the cold or some bizarre.
No, it's trying to find
This is
it.
actually you're actually trying
Yes,
to go.
it's
Okay.
trying
Do most
to-
of your families like go skiing? and
I would
stuff?
say a good portion of them go somewhere
Wow.
where it's snow. Like
Okay.
the ones who do ski absolutely go to those places during
Yeah.
this time because it's a great time for it.
It is a great time
So,
for it.
of
We've
course-
had a lot of snow. So
Yeah, I've
we've been
heard.
on this like every other, once a week, 6 to 8 inch, rotation that
Yeah.
usually comes later in the spring, but it's come early this year.
Yeah, well, we had a bunch of families actually out in Colorado.
Okay, yeah.
Just this past week. So on that note, you're from Colorado with the Colson Center. Maybe you can share a little bit, just kind of introduce yourself to some of our audience who wouldn't know you. You've
Yeah.
written a couple books, and then also what is the Colson Center
Yeah.
and some of the history there.
Well, listen, the Colson Center is simple. We exist. We were founded by the late, great Chuck Colson as one of the things that he really cared about, which was helping Christians learn how to think and understand what was happening in the culture from a Christian worldview. When we don't understand what's happening in the culture, especially when things get a little chaotic like they are now, then we can either retreat to anger or we can retreat to kind of, throwing our hands up. There's nothing we can do about it.
It's hopeless.
It's hopeless. And neither of those are, I think, the biblical alternative. And so when you actually have the grounding of ultimate truth, what's ultimately true about reality and what's ultimately true about humans, and have a sense that really it's God at work in the world and we join him, well, then that changes the whole game. Mm-hmm. Suddenly you can have a level of clarity and confidence and courage that you don't have without it. And so that's really what we exist to do, is help people understand what's happening in the world from that perspective of what's true.
Yeah, and then you also have authored a couple of books.
Yeah. A couple. I co-author books because it's
Co-author
quicker.
books.
Yeah, that's the secret apparently.
Okay, so should I not have used esteemed then at the
No,
start? Only a co-author.
If you co-author, you're esteemed, but not very esteemed.
Okay,
so that's
gotcha.
where you
All
went
right,
wrong.
okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, the most recent one is a practical guide to culture, and that was one that my co-author Brett Kunkel and I wrote basically as dads. I mean, he's got 5 kids, I've got 4. How quickly the world has changed can be really dizzying. I mean, things that were just unthinkable just yesterday, it seems like, is unquestionable today, and it just happened so fast. So how do you make sense of that, and then how do you help your kids navigate through that? Part of that is knowing what's important and what's not important. That's half the game, right? We can lose our minds on any given day on anything, and there's a whole industry that feeds that. So really just kind of understanding, this really does matter. This is something that my student really does need to be able to navigate. This is something I need to say no to. This is something I need to say yes to. As a dad of teenagers at the time, I really wanted to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, well, you're gonna have to share all your secrets with me as a dad of
I
pre-teenagers.
got it all figured out. Yeah.
But before we get into all that, which is where we're going to spend most of our time, so shameless family history.
Okay.
You mentioned Chuck Colson, obviously, who started, and he started with the Nixon administration.
That's right.
And went to prison, started a very famous prison ministry, totally turned his life around. So my grandfather actually worked with Chuck Colson.
That's amazing.
So he was a special assistant to President Eisenhower, and then was the Undersecretary of Commerce under Nixon.
Wow.
And I remember I must have been in my late teens, and I learned about Chuck Colson and how he became a believer. My grandfather, who's no longer with us, but he was not a believer. And I said, "Hey, did you know Chuck Colson?" And he just went like, I mean, I've never seen him turn so white. And I said, yeah, he turned his life around, and it's interesting. He could not believe it.
Wow.
Because he had such a bad experience, and this was obviously before Chuck was a believer, before he turned his life around, and so to me, it's always been just a fascinating story of the power of Christ and redemption, and how a person can change, because. I mean, he just couldn't believe that he could have become something.
He's not alone. I mean, the skepticism when he did convert by national media figures and everything was pretty palpable at the time. They thought it was a kind of a jailhouse conversion, although he did convert before prison. There's some wonderful stories. He tells some of them. Other people have told him where he ran into former political enemies and apologized and confessed to them, and they just don't know really what to do. But he had a 35, I think, year career after that, where he lived a long life of faithfulness.
Yeah.
But to your grandfather's credit, even the New York Times, the day he died, the story wasn't about the change.
Sure.
The story was about what a jerk he was, and he told that story himself.
Yeah.
Well,
I think, and my grandfather was
unfortunately
never accepted the reality of Christ's power.
Right.
And but to me, it's always been such a. I mean, clearly, 35 years of his life was dedicated to the Lord and doing His work in some of the darkest corners of the globe.
Yeah. I mean, your story testifies to both. He was a piece of work before Jesus, and Jesus just changed him, which is just really wonderful.
Yeah. So let's get into culture. I mean, speaking of Jesus changing people and transformation, and on some level, as a Christian school, that's obviously what we're hoping for here. And I got to hear a lot of your talk this morning. So maybe I start with, in light of today's culture, what should the goal of a Christian school be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a Christian school has to take something into account, and that is, obviously more than one thing. I mean, we need to know the landscape. We need to know that the discipleship process, and this is important for parents too, is not done in a vacuum, right? No, it's not. It'd be hard enough if all we had to do in raising the next generation was deal with their own sin nature, But we got to deal with all these cultural forces and voices and extra family influences. And this is a pretty dramatic shift from the history of the world, where you have these institutional and very, very loud, consistent voices in the ears of young people. I mean, you go back 100 years and, parents are working on their own farms, and that's where kids are. And it just is not the amount of noise, just the amount of noise. The other thing I think Christians need to take seriously in terms of that discipleship and educational process is that God determined that our kids would live in this cultural moment and not in another one. That's what Paul says in Acts 17, that God determines the exact times that people live and the boundaries of their dwelling place, and He does it so that people can reach out to Him and find Him. So we have to take what are at times can seem just like the overwhelming challenges of the cultural moment and say, this is what God intended. God intended this for my son and daughter.
Our kids were meant to be born at this time, despite the challenges that exist.
That's right. And so all the purposes that God has for us, right? And, Paul talks about how we're God's workmanship, in Ephesians, that we are, given certain gifts to be expressed in service of Him, that we're to go into the world and make disciples. I mean, so all these aspects of what it means to be called into this life of Christ is also then shaped by what it means to do that today. And to take that seriously is I think is required if we're going to be a truly Christian education. I often say with Christian schools, look, Christian school is not just school with Christian stuff added on it. Yeah. It's not just, it's not just school with longer skirts and shorter hair, It's not just even, Christian school with chapel. It's not just, basketball and you pray before the game. Yeah. There's a way that we are to rethink what is our purpose as human beings and align the educational process towards that purpose. And that requires a level of intentionality. I've definitely seen an incredible amount of intentionality here at Santa Fe, which is great to see that, because I think the leadership here takes that really seriously, and good for them because they need to.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way that we like to say it sometimes with people who come inquiring about our school is it's not school with a little Jesus add-on pull-out, right? I mean, that is the center. It should be integrated in everything that we're doing. And everything we're doing, should point towards our mission of developing Christian leaders.
Yeah, it should. And, measuring it too. Measuring success is not just how many kids got into what colleges or what was the GPA. Yeah. What were our test scores compared to our peer schools? I mean, for Christian education, it really is, what kind of parents will they become themselves? What kind of husbands? And how will they, see the work that they do, wherever that is, whatever God calls them to do, is in service to Him? Do they have that sort of approach and framework to life? And, absolutely that should involve excellence, but it has to involve purpose.
Yeah. And I know you spoke a lot about purpose. I'm going to come back to that a little bit. I actually want to talk first about discernment, because I think it tags in a little with what you're saying about, hey, are our students going to become good fathers and mothers? Are they going to become good partners, good people, people after God's own heart? And maybe you could share a little bit about what you share with our staff about the role of discernment and developing discernment in our students.
Yeah, well, just that it's an absolute requirement. If discernment is not something that we develop as individuals living in this particular cultural moment, then we're destined to be brainwashed and deceived in some way. And that's just because we live in the noisiest culture in the history of the world. I mean, nothing else can compare to this. Yeah. We have amazing capacity to find any piece of knowledge that we want. But the problem is that same technology that gives us that access to that many resources is also shouting at us all the time from a million different directions. Yeah. This is why we are already kind of labeled as the information age.
Right.
Usually it takes 100 years and people look back and write books and they're like, yeah, we should call that the exploration age because everyone said all.
We're doing it in the middle of it now.
Well, there's no question, because it is as big of a shift to the information age is a shift as big as the one to the Industrial Revolution. And it just changed everything. It's not just that you have, this is the way of life and we'll just dump a bunch of information into it. It's that now access to information is the new currency. The ability to process information and lead to an ends is new. I mean, it's changed what we mean by competence. It's changed what we mean by it's changed how we understand family and church. It literally will change everything. And so the problem is that age of information brings with it kind of a bombardment of ideas about life and purpose and God and truth and heaven and hell. So, information is rarely neutral. Information is trying to tell you something. It's either telling you something that's true or not true, something that is significant. I mean, obviously, a lot of the information tries to distract us from what's really important to what's not important, and to think that that is important. So, being able to navigate this is not. It's not just about having truth, because if all we do is give our kids truth in a world where they're given so much information, then that true information might get lost in the sea of information. So they have to have a capacity, an ability. They have to cultivate a virtue of being able to have what Nancy Pearcey calls a baloney detector. I love that line, which is just like the ability to say, that isn't true, and that's why. The ability to tell the difference between an assertion and an argument. And it's amazing, how many times you have a conversation and somebody's like, I don't think Jesus would send anyone to hell. Okay, well, that's an assertion, but that's not an argument. Because you believe it doesn't make it true. Is it true or is it not true? And how do we know? The ability to actually wrestle with information, analyze it, and figure out what's true. And then also the discernment to know which sources are trustworthy and which are not. So I think what is true and who can I trust are inevitable questions that arise in our cultural moment, and they're ingredients of discernment. You got to be able to do those two things.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important and maybe a little bit of a radical shift in the mentality of sometimes, and even me as a parent, right? I think for a lot of our community, we send our kids to Christian school because we want them to be told, the right things.
Yeah. What are you going to tell them? Right.
And you're saying there's another level to that, which is we could tell them all the right things, but they could get out in the world and hear a whole bunch of other things. And if they don't have this discernment, it's going to make them question everything.
Yeah,
So,
maybe this example will help. I didn't tell this morning, but I do a daily commentary podcast called Breakpoint. And Chuck Colson founded it, and of course, it wasn't a podcast back then. There was no such thing.
Sure.
It was a radio
column or something.
Yeah, so we're on radio and print and everything. You can subscribe to it. And obviously, not everyone always agrees with everything we say. I don't know if you knew that or not, but
with me, everyone always agrees.
Does. So you don't
I'm
know.
sorry you don't have the
Let me
same
share with you
experience.
my experience. Sometimes people get upset. I don't know if you remember when Disney started making these live action remakes of these classic cartoons. Yeah. And the first one was Cinderella, and it was fantastic. I mean, better than the cartoon, if you ask me. That Cinderella was amazing. And then they announced Beauty and the Beast. And then they announced that Emma Watson from Harry Potter fame was going to be in this one. And my girls were hooked. This is at this time, my girls are, I have 3 daughters. They're probably, 10, 8, and 6.
Okay, so they all want to be Hermione.
Oh, are you kidding me? Of course, the Disney princess movement was the most successful marketing campaign in the history of the planet. Anyway, they were so excited. So we're waiting. It's a year off when they announce it. A month out, right, is when they then announce there's a gay moment in there. I don't know if you remember this. And it was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, what am I going to do about this? Because they're so excited about it. Their friends are excited about it. And I think there were 3 options that parents had. Many people chose to say, nope, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to let my kid watch it. We're not going to watch it. It's not worth it. Not going to do it. I think that's a legitimate response. The other response was, a second option was to go see it and hope that the gay moment was missed. And honestly, it was pretty understated, what they were talking about. I think they were actually trying to get, a credit with certain organizations for doing very minimal and not losing their audience, and they were walking a tight line. And honestly, obviously it's so different today because it's so blatant today. But just back then, I think many parents thought maybe we can go see it and then hope they don't notice. And then the third is go see it, make sure they notice, and
talk
point
about
it out.
Yeah.
I think of those 3 options, the one that is the wrong approach. I don't feel like I'm old enough to judge too many parents in how they make parenting decisions. But the ones that I think that was the wrong approach for our cultural moment, for the kind of training that kids need, was that second one.
Mm-hmm. The hope
they don't notice. Because, culture is most powerful in the way that we think. Not in what it yells at us but it's when what seems normal. If something seems normal, then we don't question it. If something seems normal, then we're not discerning about it. If something seems normal, it's already convinced us. And I think that was the wrong approach there because, if they don't notice a gay moment in that movie, they're not going to notice a gay moment the next time you're on, in an airport or you're out to dinner and that sort of stuff. And now I'm not talking about people being normal or abnormal. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that there has to be an understanding of what's right and what's wrong. And when things in a cultural moment that are wrong are called right, then it can deceive us and it can deceive our kids just under the lens of normalcy. And so somehow you still got to continue to back up and say, well, what's normal? So our decision with our 10, 8, and 6-year-old, and it got a little awkward and it got a little weird, was to say, okay, we're going to go see it, and then we're going to have a long conversation afterwards. And what did you see in that scene right there? Well, let me tell you what you saw in that scene right there. You saw this. What do you think that says? And so on. And I think that the development of discernment comes not by hiding from the really difficult questions, but from jumping in and pointing them to truth through the middle of it.
Well, I think that is also one of the greatest challenges as a Christian school. I'll say
it
that.
It is, yeah.
And this is one of my questions. So I work only with the high school.
Okay.
So I'm talking about older students. In particular, I'm thinking about our juniors and seniors who are, in some cases months away from being totally on their own. And I have found most people like the idea of their kid learning discernment until in the process of trying to, you can't, it's hard to teach discernment without eventually giving them a little bit of space to try to discern things on their own.
Right. Yeah.
So as a parent, if your student comes home and has used their discerning skills and come up with a different conclusion than you want them to, suddenly it's, what are you teaching over at that school?
Right.
So how do we as a school find that right balance? I mean, or even just as a parent, how do you handle, because we like the idea of discernment, but we also want them to think the things we want them to think. And I feel like it pushes us to go back to, if I just say it enough, if I just say the truth enough, it'll be okay.
Yeah.
And then they don't get that discerning ability.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think the fundamental place to begin is not everything's up for grabs, right?
Yeah.
Whether God exists or not, that's not
Sure.
up for grabs.
Yeah.
But discernment at the end of the day is the ability to think for oneself. Just because you're helping someone develop discernment and they exercise discernment doesn't mean they won't exercise it wrongly. It doesn't mean that it's not a wonderful role that parents and teachers have to step in and go, you're doing that wrong. And unfortunately, we live in a culture where we're really hesitant to tell people that they're wrong, including students. But that's the best way to love students. The word education itself means to lead someone out of, to lead someone out of ignorance.
Yeah.
That assumes that the students are in ignorance. That's a safe assumption when it comes to a lot of different things, right?
Yeah.
I'm not, you obviously want them to be able to increasingly think for themselves, but that has to have, continued correction.
Yeah.
We do that in sports. We do that in kind of technical fields, let's say in, engineering or something like that, where we know that the consequence of a mistake could be big.
Right. Yeah.
For some reason, we think we shouldn't do that in the area of biology, or for some reason, we think we shouldn't do that in the area of Bible and morality. But those have just as big a consequences as anything else. Second thing I would say is that the more that parents see themselves as partnering with you in that process, as opposed to outsourcing that to you,
right,
then the easier it's going to be on everybody, right? My kids are at a Christian school in a hybrid format, 3 days a week, more of a university model, back in Colorado, and there's plenty of times we disagree with the teachers and some of the things that they have said. And so we disagree.
Yeah.
And we say, here's where I think they're coming from and why they got here. And here's why I think that they're missing something. Partially. And, we have a killer, just an absolute killer history class there. A teacher who's just brilliant. It's very kind of integrated with history and literature. I love what they're getting out of this class. And theologically, the teacher is deeply committed in a way that I'm not. We're all under Christ.
Right.
He is that. He's there, and so it's helpful to know that about him, because then if he goes down makes some conclusions that we don't agree with, doesn't mean that everything he's doing for my kids isn't great. Right. It is great. So I would encourage parents to have that as a partnership model.
I actually think that helps the kids learn to discern.
Oh, it's great.
Two people they love and respect would come to different conclusions on something, and that their parents are not afraid to sort of say, like, well, actually, here's what we think.
Yeah. And, we've got to keep the line clear between ultimate and primary and then secondary issues. And that's become really hard. Yeah. I think COVID made that really hard.
Yeah.
I think the political environment makes that really hard, because in a sense, when you become a culture in which everything is dependent on political outcomes, which like ours is, then everything's do or die. Yeah. And then you start to think of everything as do or die. And I feel like we've really entered that.
Yeah, and the other side is the enemy.
That's right. Chuck used to quote this quirky French guy named Jacques Ellul, who talked about what he called the political illusion. And the political illusion is, whenever you think that all problems are political and therefore all solutions are political. But then he continued and he said, if you have it, then you think, well, if my guy is in everything will be great. And if their guy's in, everything is bad. No, that doesn't mean that there are some of their guys that are bad, and there's some of our guys that are bad.
Yeah.
But it's just a matter of, I think understanding that all people are fallen and prone to mistakes, and to get to know people and give them the benefit of the doubt. And so that relationship between parents and teachers, I think, is a lot easier on some of these harder questions if we see each other as co-belligerents, so to speak, in dealing with it.
Amen. Well, I mean, we've used that word culture a lot so far.
Sure.
So I don't know, maybe if you want to define that, and then also talk about what you see as some of the biggest cultural challenges facing our kids today.
Well, I mean, look, culture is used a lot, but hardly defined. So usually for Christians, it's like the culture, like that's all the bad stuff we don't like. And what that misses is the fact that culture is anywhere humans are. The culture predates the fall. Culture is not a result of sin. Culture is affected by sin. And that part of what God created us to do is to make culture, right? I mean, that's what he told Adam and Eve to do. It's what is called the cultural mandate. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. In other words, humans do something different with the world. Animals, they consume. They're consumers. They're not producing, right? Maybe they make beaver makes a dam, but he's not building an apartment complex for every other people, even other beavers to move into, really, right? What humans do is that we have the world and we make something of the world. And that's part of what it means to be made in the image of God. So culture is what we do with the world. It's the worlds we make of the world. And we can either make good worlds or bad worlds. We can make worlds that are dehumanizing or worlds that lead to human flourishing. We can either, create educational worlds, cultures that lead to discernment or that lead to indoctrination. We can, basically teach kids how to think and that it's normal to think and that learning is cool. Or we can have environments that, dismiss all. I mean, you can just see how these kind of cultures are made. So whenever a Christian institution of any kind is formulated, you have to think about culture. Obviously, the business world's picked this up. I think it was Peter Drucker, I think, who said, culture eats strategy for lunch.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? So it doesn't matter what your strategy is in your business. If you got a culture of underperformance, that's what you'll get. Now, you also have, though, kind of what happens on a kind of a meta or an Uber level across, for example, the Western world or the developing world, where you have that kind of ultimate level of culture and the direction that it's going. And we've seen historically, for example, with the invention of the printing press and the distribution of Scripture and the Protestant Reformation, then Christian influence, reached the level of that meta culture, that Uber culture. So Christians, even though we feel, I think, that in the West we don't have a whole lot of control over that kind of Uber or meta level of culture, we still have a responsibility for the culture of our families and the culture of our communities. In other words, what Paul says, to the person who knows to do good and doesn't do it, it's sin. I mean, that's a pretty specific bar. Like, do the good you can. If you can't change the world, change what you can change. Yeah. And so that's why I think culture matters for us. Another way to think about culture that I think is helpful is norms in terms of just kind of what you take for granted. I took my oldest daughter with me to Australia when she was 9. And we get there, jump in a taxi, and she's like, they're driving on the wrong side of the road, right? Now, they weren't. They were driving on the right, they were driving. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they were driving on the normal side of the road, but it never occurred to her that someone could do that, right? Yeah. And I took my middle daughter to the Dominican Republic. I was working with a great Christian school down there, and she was just like, Dad, this is like a different world. And it's because it's not a different creation, but it is a different world because humans can make worlds and make different things normal. When the norms shift, and I think that's what a lot of us feel as a pain point, norms about marriage, norms about sex, norms about leisure time and entertainment, norms about interpersonal relationships. These norms have shifted. A lot of these norms have shifted pretty dramatically in decades. And a lot of us have lived through it, right? I think most parents now are somewhere between Gen Xers and millennials, depending on how. I'm a Gen Xer. We were blamed for everything that was going wrong with the world. And so,
well, as like a quasi millennial, like the very front end, I think that's true.
you think it's every generation blames the other. But you just, even now the Gen Xers are turning around going, what
happened?
Yeah. What? Yeah. How is that up in the air?
Yeah.
When did we decide that was okay? And it is funny to get to that point because we were the cynical, sarcastic generation making fun of the boomers for being so morally pure, prudish. And now we're kind of going, what has happened? So,
yeah. So in terms of our kids, what are they facing now? And there's a couple that you mentioned that gosh, just in my work here really rung true. Like you mentioned, lack of conflict resolution skills. So I teach a class, we call it a freshman seminar, mostly because we haven't come up with a better name yet. But it's basically like, so here you are in high school. Here's some things to think about, and we talk about what is empathy. And we talk about, hey, when you're communicating with someone, maybe look them in the eye. And we talk about conflict resolution as one of the topics. And, my joke with them is, this is what you do. You are friends, you get in conflict, and you decide that because you are in conflict, you should never speak to one another ever again.
Yeah.
And then your friend group decides which side they're going to take. And then you do this over and over and over again until by the time you're a senior, you have, two friends left because you've splintered so much because you never learned how to resolve conflict.
But think about that in our context, right? Where you hear over and over and over that if somebody makes a mistake, then they're canceled.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Think about where if somebody is wrong here, we have to write them off in every other area.
Right. So that's what they're doing with their friends.
Yeah, they've never known any different. So the fact that listen, they're teenagers. They're not going to be great at conflict resolution to begin with.
Sure.
But then to see how everybody around them handles conflict resolution, like how the conflicts is happening politically, what's happened now after COVID where people have canceled their own churches and uncles have canceled their nephews and, on the political side of the aisle. I think that's really, I don't think we give enough attention to those norms. Like it is now normal to write someone off for making what was considered yesterday a pretty small mistake.
Yeah.
It is abnormal to forgive. Forgiveness is weird. Forgiveness is bizarre. That's the center of the Christian faith.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that's pretty much the gospel, right?
Yeah.
It was bizarre when Jesus talked about it too.
So I think we do need to have a little bit of confidence here as parents that if we're willing to jump into these kind of murky waters, there's also a great opportunity.
Yeah.
There's a great opportunity. But if you don't jump in, then the narrative, the norms is going to be those are going to be determined by what is seen around you.
Yeah. What are some of the other things culturally specifically that you think are challenging to today's kids?
Yeah. I mentioned information and discernment. I think I think the relational aspect and, the other thing too is that so many of our relationships are mediated. They're done over screens and they're done over text and the giving someone the benefit of the doubt and eyeball to eyeball and listening to the tone of their voice and the nonverbals. Look, employers tell us all the time that this generation of young people, they can't read nonverbals. Well, how could they? How could they? You don't get nonverbals from a screen. So these are things that I think have to all be kind of brought into preparation for life. Yeah, the deeper one though is that I think this has been one of the most consequential shifts in our lifetimes is the shift from the human identity as being something fixed, whatever that is. In Christianity, it's image of God, and atheism, it's, we're animals with a conscience, but at any level, it's fixed. There's an identity to human beings, even if it was a devolved identity. To today, where identity is up for grabs and identity has to be constructed. So identity is not something that we recognize today in every sort of aspect of life and culture, and that includes particularly higher academics. It is assumed across all the social sciences and now increasingly in the hard sciences that identity is constructed
You make your own.
You make your own. You have to make your own. And this is what's called expressive individualism, that the goal of life is to express yourself, and everyone's job is to express themselves and to accept everyone else's expression of themselves without judgment. That's so deeply embedded. Just 3 weeks ago, we were like, oh, I did not have, agreeing with one of the most notorious atheists in America, in the Western world on my bingo card last year, but Richard Dawkins, famously wrote The God Delusion, thinks belief in God is foolish, all that sort of stuff. He goes after the Scientific American, which is a publication, a very prestigious scientific publication for saying that sex is not a binary. So this is not, child psychology. This is not adolescent psychology journal. This is not,
this is the hard
the
science,
Rolling
medical,
Stone
right,
or the Atlantic even. This is Scientific American, where a guy is saying that sex is not binary. Now, of course, there's not an aspect of biology in which sex is not binary. You have some aberrations, in terms of if you're looking at the animal world, or you're looking at extra chromosomes that a very, 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 very minute population of humans are born with. But no, the world is such a sexed place, and I mean male, female, binary place, that most languages in the history of the world have given everything either a male or female modifier, right? And French is an example, Spanish is an example. Yeah. You have female words and male words, and it's just a recognition. So for a biological magazine, a magazine of biology, of science, to say that sex is not a binary, it's the same as gender. We used to say that sex is one thing and gender is another.
Right.
Now they're saying both of those things are constructed. I'm not sure that parents have fully understood just how far down the identity rabbit hole the world has gone. It's at the core of music. So you think about what shapes it: music, movies, social media, how we live on social media, like our ability to flex and construct our identity, and then of course higher education. So listen, culture is always influenced primarily by the educators and the artists and our technologies. So if you look at what's happening in education, what's happening in art, and what's happening in technology, and this is a trifecta when it comes to putting identity up in the air.
Well, John, this has been amazing so far. Obviously, there's still a lot that we can talk about. Do you mind sticking around and we can do a part two?
Yeah, let's do a part two. That sounds great.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here, and thank you for listening. You can catch part two of our podcast with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. And if this is your first time checking out one of our podcasts, we got lots of other Eagle Perspective episodes as well. You can find us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, elsewhere podcasts are available. Don't miss the video podcasts on YouTube. We'll be back with more of John Stonestreet in just a minute.